Davis, what was the purpose, do you think, of John Major's interview this morning?
Well, I guess Number 10 asked him to do it. That was the first thing. And being a loyal supporter of a Tory party, he'd do that. But I guess he was trying to reduce the credibility of the Leave campaign's claims. I mean, certain irony in it, really, when you consider the most incredible claim has been from George Osborne, or the Treasury rather, in terms of his forecast, and even what John Major said this morning. Remember, I was his last defender in the Commons. Even what he said this morning, the numbers he was bandying around were just plumb wrong.
Which numbers?
Well, he said, for example, that this controversial 350 million a week number was 3 times too high. He said it was a third of that. That's 5 billion. That's half the actual net.
The net figure.
Net contribution. He said that industries would face 10% levies. Well, the car industry would, but most of the others, it's 1 to 5. You know, if you leave out agriculture, about 1 to 5. So, you know, he was actually not being very straightforward with the numbers himself.
Were you surprised how personal it was? How personal the attacks on Boris? I mean, we know he's long hated Ian Duncan Smith. There's a revenge match there. And that's understandable from his point of view. But also, I mean, saying that in the hands of Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, IDS, that the NHS would be like a hamster in a room with a python. I mean, he's trashing.
It was a pretty harsh.
He's trashing the Tory brand.
It was a pretty harsh attack, and I mean, I don't think very wise. I mean, I think one of the problems, both sides of this campaign, has been they've been too personalised. I don't think it gains anything. I don't think the public like it. And as you say, after the 23rd, we've got to pull the party together, make it work.
Well, that's going to be difficult.
And with that sort of attack, it's a very bad idea. You know.
Sam, what do you? I mean, let me put it this way: whatever the result, things for the Tories are never going to be the same again, at least for the rest of this Parliament, are they?
It's going to be very hard. Clearly, with a working majority of about 18, it's going to be very hard to get contentious legislation through. I think that's the biggest area of danger for David Cameron going forward, is that he basically is a sort of zombie prime minister. He can't do anything because he can't get it through the Commons, and then the Lords is a whole different matter where a lot of other legislation will get stuck. So you saw the kind of things in the Queen's speech, with the exception of the data bill, which we'll probably come on to talk about. I can't see that any of the bills will end up being that radical when they get passed into law. Now, do I think that there's going to be a successful coup after June the 23rd? That seems quite unlikely, because the people
even if it's a vote to leave?
If there's a vote to leave, I think that changes things. I think that there will be I think that David Cameron would go within his own time.
But vote to remain, there's not
in the case of a vote
coup.
to remain, there are between 20 and 50 MPs who really viscerally now dislike David Cameron. I'm not sure that number has dramatically increased solely as a result of the EU referendum campaign, and there is a safety valve. It's the leadership election that will happen in this Parliament, possibly sooner than you think, because of the tensions.
There may not be an immediate coup, even if it's vote to remain. But I think the key word there from Sam, which key words, zombie parliament. There are anything between 20 and 50 Tory MPs who are now deeply disillusioned with the Prime Minister. They've got a taste for revolt and doing their own things. The government's majority is derisory. This government could now find it very difficult to get anything major through this potential zombie parliament.
I think that's absolutely true, but also on the matter of a coup, I think that there are a number of mischief makers within the Tory ranks who don't mind if a coup succeeds or fails. They feel that the Labour opposition is so weak that they have the luxury of doing one coup, another coup, and let's maybe have a third coup.
No, I think the numbers are lower than you think. I mean, Sam said 20 to 50. I'd say 20. I don't think it's more than that. Of the ones who
that's enough, given the government's majority.
These are the ones who sort of hate the regime group, as it were. But you've got another group, and the real problem, in my view, comes not if there's a Brexit victory, if there's a Leave victory. The real problem comes if it's a very narrow Remain victory, because there'll be a lot of the Brexiteers who feel has been cheated. You know, they'll bring back the 9 million spent on the leaflet and all the Purdah stuff, all of that, and they'll be difficult to manage. I mean, that'll be the problem under those circumstances.
Well, this is a government that's already found it hard to get its budget through. Indeed, almost unprecedented. It lost most of the major parts of the budget that was unveiled in March. Will it not be even more difficult if, as David Davis says, it's a vote to remain but small, to get its business through, except the most non-controversial stuff.
Yeah, I mean, to say it's difficult isn't a prediction of the future, it's a description of the past 10 months. They had to capitulate on tax credit cuts, they had to capitulate on their planned reform of pensions, and then the academisation of
And
state
TTIP,
schools.
the European-American potential trade deal?
Most recently, and that's prior to the referendum. So I imagine things do become very difficult afterwards, and David Cameron, in many ways, David Cameron will end up leading my kind of government. It won't do very much. It'll do the absolutely basic macro strategic stuff and nothing.
So Jeffersonian government.
Exactly. Well, what the founders intended in America. The one bit of optimism I think there is for the Tories, and it sort of picks up on David's point, is that I wouldn't underestimate how many Tory MPs just want this referendum done with. And that includes a lot of absolutely committed leavers who don't think very much of David Cameron.
But in this
You
kind
saw
of...
that, you saw it this morning. You were interviewing Johnny Mercer. He
Yeah.
wants it over. You know, you
No,
could
well, that
tell
was
from
clear.
the demeanour. You know.
I mean, he wouldn't look at me.
Yeah.
Mind you, maybe another reason for that. But, all right, no need
that
to
was
go there.
before the makeup.
No need to go there. Let me ask you this, though. Given the kind of environment our panel are talking about, and it's already difficult, as Janice says, for the government to get things done, I would suggest it become even more difficult after the referendum if it's remained by a small majority. Does that give you hope for your continued opposition to the Investigatory Powers Act, the Surveillance Act for the police and the intelligence services?
In a way, I'm going to pick up Jana's Jeffersonian view, because look what happened with tax credits. There were about 40 people opposing it. Only 2 people, me and Steve McPartland, voted against it. But it went to the Lords, got knocked back. But the government knew there was a sort of looming rebellion there. And I think that's going to be the message of the future. You're going to have quite a lot of that pressure play. So take the Investigatory Powers Act. There are large parts of it which are going to get flayed by the Lords, and the government's going to concede when it comes back. That's the sort of way it'll happen. Whether it's the approval mechanisms or the data that's gathered or who has access to it, all those things will be challenged, and all those things will now be more at risk. Or at least after the referendum, we're more at risk than they were. Maybe that's why they're rushing it through in a hurry now. They're trying to get it through in the next few days.
I would suggest that in looking at the campaign, just 2.5 weeks to go, that in the week up to the Whitsun bank holiday, Remain won that. There was overwhelming economic stuff coming out. They seemed to dominate the debate. In the weeks since, leading up to this weekend, Leave have probably done better this weekend. We've had the 2 debates, interviews on Sky, a lot more coming up. Still all to play for, but Leave goes into this week probably with a spring in its step.
With Purdah.
I think that's right.
You think Purdah's made
And I think one of the mistakes of the Remain campaign was at 2 different points in the last 6 weeks to sort of feel like they were heading for victory. Once was in the immediate aftermath of the visit by President Obama, where they'd had Treasury reports and the visit of the US President all supporting their case, and they thought that was a big moment that was going to produce a push in the polls. And then a couple of weeks ago, again, they just sensed, they smelt in the air the polls were going their way, and they thought that, I think in private conversations, that they had pretty much got this one in the bag. And that created hubris, and that created a problem. And they did not see coming the Australian-style points system attack by Vote Leave last weekend, where they set out plans that they thought this was going to be a policy-free referendum campaign. They were wrong, and that's actually harmed them and pulled the debate much more back to the Leave side.
Is Leave beginning to think it can win now?
Well, privately, I think they're beginning to think that they have a 50-50 chance, maybe even a little bit more than that.
Which was more than they thought previously.
And previously, privately, a lot of them would admit that they felt pretty pessimistic. So I definitely do sense a shift. But if you look at what happened in Scotland, it was around this time that you began to see polls showing an advantage for independence, and there are still 3 weeks to go, so I don't think anybody is counting their chickens.
And I'm reliably informed another poll coming out shortly showing Leave ahead, but we can't talk about that because it's embargoed. I think maybe I just did, but I didn't mention it. Are Remain getting a little worried now?
I've spoken to a few of them, and they're more anxious than they were 4 weeks ago.
Still don't think they're losing.
They don't think, and what they're hung up about is the question of margin of victory. How big a victory do they need in order to put the question to bed and preserve the Prime Minister's position?
More than 52-48, I would suggest.
I would suggest so, yeah.
At least 55-45?
I think 55-45 would do it.
I think the fact that they deployed their nuclear weapon of John Major this morning tells you they're worried about losing.
John Major was the nuclear weapon.
That's it.
I think so in these terms. Yeah,
Very well.
I think so.
Lose or win? Yes or no?
Brexit outcome. Brexit.
Oh, you do? Okay. Very
Small
well.
margin, but Brexit.